Hi, welcome to today's Leaders in Mental Wellness and Diabetes, where you will hear insights from the top minds in the world of diabetes care. Hosted by Dr. Char.
Hello, how are you, sir?
I'm doing very well.
Dr. Claude Lardinois, hope I did that well, is an endocrinology consultant. He's from the greater Reno area. He's a teacher, true to the title of doctor, with interest in nutrition, diabetes, hypertension. He's especially interested in eradicating heart disease. And I hear he's an excellent dynamic speaker. Sir, it's an honor to meet you. Welcome to this podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
How in the world are you doing today, and how's the weather where you're at?
Well, the weather's nice now. We had a tremendous storm a couple of weeks ago where we got almost 4 inches of rain in Reno and in one day, and we normally get 6 inches a year. So you can imagine it was a little wet, but it's clearing up now, and it's much nicer, much nicer.
Well, this podcast is for a casual conversation for people that want the information. We live in a world where they want to know, but they don't want the clinical side of it that they don't understand, and that feels a lot of social media has made us aware of that. And so that's what this is for. It's just to inform people, to talk about issues. So do you have a personal journey with diabetes, or what got you into a world of wanting to help people who suffer in that way?
Well, people ask me that question many times, and I go back, and what I think kind of triggered me was when I was in college, I dated a girl who had type 1 diabetes. And I remember when we went out for dinner, all the things she had to do before, during, and after dinner. And I was like, wow, I couldn't deal with this. And she said, well, it's the cards you're dealt, and you live with them. And she really kind of inspired me. And then I went to medical school at George Washington, and then I did my training at Travis Air Force Base in California, and then spent 3 years in Germany. And while I was in Germany, I really got interested in diabetes. And so I decided that when I got out of the Air Force, I would pursue a career in endocrinology. So I joined the late Gerald Reaven at Stanford, who is really the father of insulin resistance. He's the one that really put insulin resistance on the map. And as I worked with him and through my 35 years at the University of Nevada School of Medicine, I really realized how powerful insulin resistance is in disease. People get really fixated, do you have pre-diabetes or not? I don't care if you have pre-diabetes. I don't even care if you have diabetes. I care if you have insulin resistance. And so that's one of the areas that I devote a lot of time to, and I encourage people to find out, do I have insulin resistance? And if you do, then you must take that very seriously. And one of the things that really annoys me is there's this belief or this mandate that obesity is what causes insulin resistance. And there's no question that obesity will make insulin resistance worse. But believe it or not, there are more people with insulin resistance who are not obese than obese patients with insulin resistance. So if you're saying, oh, this person's skinny, they can't have insulin resistance, you're missing half of the population that has insulin resistance.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's an expression I use called TOFI, TOFI. You're thin on the outside, but you're fat on the inside.
So that's skinny fat.
That's right. And that's because when I was at Stanford, one of the things that marveled me my first year as a fellow was we were doing glucose clamps on people to determine their level of insulin sensitivity. And we had patients with BMIs of 40, very obese patients. And they had no insulin resistance at all, none. Wow, how can you not have any insulin resistance? And then we had people with BMIs of 25 and 26, and they were profoundly insulin resistant. And I remember just scratching my head. I don't understand. People are telling me that obesity is the driver. Well, it wasn't. It was insulin resistance. And those people with the BMIs of 25, 26, 27 were people from like India and China. And if you look at those populations, they're not fat. They're not fat totally, but they're fat viscerally. So they have that little pudgy belly. And that pudgy belly is what drives the insulin resistance.
And what is one quick thing before we even go on, because I don't want to miss this. What's one quick thing you would tell somebody that says, wow, let me take a deep breath with that? What's one thing they could do today to know and to do to turn it around or prevent it?
Well, what I would encourage them to do, and this is met with a lot of resistance by a lot of organizations, is I recommend that you do a 2-hour glucose tolerance test. You go to the lab, you get a baseline blood sugar, you consume 75 grams of glucose, and you measure your glucose at 1 hour and at 2 hours. And if your 1 hour is over 125, or your 2 hour is over 120, you have insulin resistance. Now, where the pullback I get is they say, well, that's cumbersome and, it takes time out of their busy schedule and everything. Well, I can tell you, just looking at a fasting glucose or an A1C, like we do in the lab, it doesn't tell you anything. And the way I'll explain that is I almost never do my blood fasting. Okay. So I'll get my blood done, 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock, and my glucose is 109. And all of a sudden I'm told, oh, you have diabetes, you have pre-diabetes, you're at risk, man. You better change your life over and over. And I said, well, first of all, I've actually done a clamp on myself and I'm not insulin resistant. But second of all, that's where it's a single number doesn't help you. And the other thing is that's a static number. In order to know if your pancreas works, you have to challenge it. You have to challenge the pancreas. And the only way you can challenge it is by giving either glucose or a mixed meal. And then see how your pancreas responds. And I can assure you, and my colleagues, my former students and residents who are now practicing, when they started doing glucose tolerance tests, they call me up and says, I can't believe it. This guy had a 85 fasting blood sugar. And there was no way, he wasn't overweight or anything. There's no way he'd have a problem. And his 1 hour glucose was 190.
So once they find that out, is this just for type 2s or can type 1s do that as well?
I would say probably focus more on type 2s. I would say not even focus on people who don't even have diabetes.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I'm saying, there's a lot of people running around. Remember, if you look at type 2 diabetes, what do the patients have long before they have high blood sugars? They have high triglycerides, low HDL, and hypertension. All the features of insulin resistance. So if people say to me, do I have diabetes or not? And I go, no. Oh, I feel so relieved. I said, well, I wouldn't be relieved because your triglycerides are high, your HDL is low, and your blood pressure is out of sight. And those are going to kill you. They're going to kill you very quickly, long before your blood sugar, your concerns about your blood sugar.
And once someone knows that level, what's the first thing now we know diet is, and we're going to get to obesity here in a minute. I got some good questions, I hope.
Right.
What's one of the first tips you give that they can do right then?
Well, I think once we've determined you have insulin resistance, I think it has to say to yourself that this puts you at a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease, kidney failure, stroke, things like that. So you have to really look in the mirror and say, I need to make some lifestyle changes. And those can be modifying your food intake, developing an exercise program. I mean, it's very sad to say that I think it's still only about 15% of the population that exercises regularly. Okay, 15%. And
our world has made that easy. It's our fault.
Right.
It's our responsibility, but the world has made that so easy.
Right. And I just laugh too when I go to conferences because they have the big escalators, okay? And whoever takes the steps, even in some conferences, they won't let you take the steps because they're worried you might fall. Or the joke I have is I show a 24-hour fitness center And the fitness center has escalators so you can get up to the door.
That is,
to get in
isn't
there.
that the,
So,
I have never thought of that.
Yeah, I show that as a joke in some of my talks and say, yeah, here's this 24-hour exercise place, but they have an escalator so you can get into it.
That is
Wow.
hilarious. Now that is good. That's really good. So anybody that's not even dealing with diabetes can go and request of their doctor. They're probably not going to offer that test, maybe, but they can go request that of them for themselves, right? Of their primary care.
I would strongly urge them to do that. Now, like I said, there's going to be pushback because even the American Diabetes Association has said, we really don't see that this is necessary. Well, I had a colleague once who routinely does glucose tolerance tests. So we took all the data from his studies and we compared what the ADA said. Okay, fasting blood sugar over 104 or something means insulin resistance. A hemoglobin A1C maybe 6.3, 6.4. That's solid evidence for insulin resistance. Well, then we said, okay, let's glucose challenge them and see what happens. And what he found was it's about 50-50. Half the time you were right, they had insulin resistance, half the time you were wrong. Because you're saying, well, their A1C is only 6, they can't have insulin resistance. Well, again, you're looking at a static number.
Mm-hmm.
You have to challenge, you have to see, how does the beta cell respond? If the beta cell doesn't respond, then that's going to tell you every time you eat, you're going to have an abnormal response. And so you're never going to know that unless you actually do the test. And one paper that came out it's probably a couple of years old now, but again, it really drives home this point to me. They had over 8,000 patients that they studied, and all the patients to get in the study had to have had a heart attack. Okay, so they already had heart disease, no question.
Mm-hmm.
When pre-heart disease, they had to have heart disease. They looked at their ICD codes, and probably 15% had a diagnosis of diabetes. Maybe 15% of those 8,000. There were maybe 20, 25% that had a pre-diabetes diagnosis, and the rest were defined as normal by the ICD, by whatever ICD codes the patient had. So they got all these patients and they give glucose tolerance tests on them. Now, obviously, if they had diabetes, they didn't do a glucose tolerance test because you don't want to create a problem. And there were some patients that refused to have the test. But overall, I think they did about 5,000 patients where they did glucose tolerance tests. And what they did was they completely rechanged the whole ICD codes for those patients. There were patients who were normal that had frank diabetes. There were patients that had pre-diabetes that had diabetes. So again, it illustrated that looking at a static number, and again, I emphasize a static number is not useful in making a diagnosis of a disease.
That is so interesting. Now, I read also that you're, I guess, just more than interested in the education as well as health. But can you tell us what defined your focus on obesity before I ask you about a pandemic?
Well, it wasn't really obesity that defined me. It was more insulin resistance. And
that led you to it.
It led me to it, and realizing that obesity can clearly, in people that are prone to having obesity, I mean, insulin resistance, I mean, particularly if you look at the Chinese and the Indian population, they have a very high risk of genetic insulin resistance. And as long as, 40 years ago, when they had their bicycle instead of their car, and they didn't have McDonald's and things like that, they did okay. I mean, I tell people getting diabetes is like 50% genetics. Okay, you must do a good job of picking your parents. Okay, and 50% is what I call foot and fork. Okay, so if you use too much fork and you don't use enough foot, and you combine that with your genetics, then bad things happen to you.
I hope you have a t-shirt in a product room somewhere that people can buy. That is so good.
Yeah, I never thought about it. I actually wrote a paper once on foot and fork disorder. And the editor, I wrote disorder, DYSORDER instead of DIS. And the editor said, I'm not going to publish the paper if you don't use the correct grammar. And I said, come on, we have dyslexia, we have dyspareunia, we have dyslipidemia, we have dysarthria. Come on, give me a break. Let me have foot and fork disorder. And he kind of said, okay, I see your point. So people say, what do you suffer from? And I said, you suffer from too much of forca and not enough of futta.
So if I give you credit, on one of my little 30-second videos, can I talk about foot and fork disorder?
Absolutely. I mean, people can relate to that. That's
that is so true.
That's the whole thing. I try to work with the patients. I can give them all this philosophical stuff, but I said, when it really gets down to it, it's what we do with our fork and it's what we do with our foot. Now, I'm not saying that that's 100%. I mean, there's certainly other variables, but I mean, let's be honest, the obesity pandemic that triggered in 1980, which really fascinated me, because all of a sudden for 60 years, we have 15% obesity from 1920, 1940, 1960, 1980. All of a sudden, we're at 45% in 2010. Well, something had to have happened. This just wasn't a fluke. And one of the things I always pounded on my students and residents, which I got to say is getting disheartening now because they just don't show that passion anymore, is when something odd happens, figure out why it happened. I mean, there has to be an explanation. It might not be easy to find the explanation, but if you never look, you'll never find out. I mean, a good example is like a high blood sugar. Okay, the patient has a high blood sugar. Well, why is it high? Oh, I don't know, it's high. I'm just going to give them more insulin. Well, wouldn't you like to know that maybe the reason it's high is because 8 hours ago they were low in the middle of the night and they rebounded from a low. So if you give them more insulin, you're only going to make the situation worse. And we showed this many times at camp. We would have kids at camp. We would show that they would have these nocturnal hypoglycemic events, and they'd be 500 in the morning. And people would say, well, their diabetes isn't well controlled. No, in fact, it was probably too controlled because they were having such severe lows. Their brain was saying, I can't live at 50 or 40. I'd rather live at 5.
Yeah. I've been type 1 for almost 49 years. And so I got married at 16. So I thought I was all grown up when I only know now that I was a child diagnosed, but I was diagnosed at 16 as well. And navigating the lows and not over compensating so that then you have to have more insulin because you overcompensated for the low can only do harm and can only emotionally impact you negatively.
Right.
And so early on, when I didn't have a Dexcom to tell me every 5 minutes what my blood sugar was, we didn't even know. We guessed at when we needed insulin more than not. I guess I'm a pretty good result at this many years in. I'm 64 and still in good health. So given where we've been and where we are, we have lots of good tools, but it's still for a 12-year-old today to have a low blood sugar and take too many carbs to compensate. It's an easy route for a mama to say, here, eat this. And so it's a job. And I do take my hat off to everybody that is interested, that's on here today, that'll take time to listen, wanting to know. And I believe there's lots of people that want to understand this. And I think understanding is key in order to make better decisions and better choices. In that, it just segued me right over to the obesity pandemic. You talked about it from 15% to 40%. And if I were to guess today, we're not going the opposite direction with it. I think we're still going up. And if it's still on the rise, and while it is a complicated disease in itself, it's a dis-ease, I call it, that we can work on and do much for, even if we are type 1. It doesn't take us out of responsibility in knowing, understanding, and working toward it. And either we can be a victim at it or not. But I say learn what we can and walk it as best we can and have a lot of tolerance to ourselves and give ourselves a lot of patience. But this little fat face says that I've got 20 pounds today. That doesn't need to be where it is on my body. But where did it start? Can you share that with us? And I think people are interested and hungry to know. And I think that you may have an answer there that'll spark our interest.
Well, I can probably provide an answer. I wish I could develop a solution. That's the challenging part of it. But what got me interested was I was just looking at in 1980, all of a sudden we had this huge surge in obesity and a huge increase in diabetes. And so I'm looking and thinking, so I look at the curves, and I'll be glad to share some of these curves with you. So I see this flat curve for 60 years, and then all of a sudden in 1980, it takes off like a rocket. And so I said, something's got to be going on. So I started looking into it. And in fact, I'm giving a presentation next Friday on this topic, and it's called How a Scientist, a U.S. Senator, an Agricultural Secretary, and a Hurricane were contributory to the obesity pandemic.
Wow.
And I'm presenting this at an international cardiology conference in Vienna, Austria. So I'm looking forward to going to Vienna. I just hope that I get all the ducks lined up with the COVID testing and vaccinating and all the other insanity things that I keep getting bombarded with. But to start this, so what happened was in around 1940, we started to see a steep rise in heart disease in America. And so in 30, it started up a little bit in 30, but in 40, it jumped pretty big. And even in the early 50s, there was this steep increase in heart disease in America. Now you're going to say, well, what does this have to do with obesity? Well, this is how it leads into it. And so everybody got concerned, rightfully so. And if you look, that's when Framingham's study started in the 1940s. Framingham heart study, looking at a group of people in Framingham, Massachusetts, to figure out why heart disease went up. And there were two very key scientists at that time. One was Ancel Keys from the US, and another guy named John Eucken from the UK. And Ancel Keys was saying the reason for the increase in heart disease is because we consume too much saturated fat and too much cholesterol. So his belief was that it was cholesterol and saturated fat. Well, Eucken had a different spin on it. He said, no, I don't really think it's that. I think it's because we consume too much sugar, that we've become this sugar fanatic country. And actually there's I have an interesting slide on fat kings and fat popes. And if you actually look at them, one of the things that they had this desire for was sugar. And some of these kings would order thousands and thousands of pounds of sugar from India and ship it to the UK so they could do this. So he felt it was sugar. So then you move on. And so Dr. Keys starts doing studies feeding people high cholesterol diets and couldn't raise their cholesterol at all. So he said, well, maybe it's not cholesterol. Maybe it's just saturated fat. So he was absolutely convinced it was saturated fat. And Eucken, because he was kind of a soft-spoken Brit, and because, sugar was a big component at that time of a lot of products. And this is pre-high fructose corn syrup, okay? But still, a lot of products had sugar in them. And a lot of the companies that sponsored programs were like Coca-Cola or Pepsi. Mm-hmm. Well, they're not going to fork over a lot of money for a conference by a Brit that says sugar's bad for you. They're just not going to do that.
Not on your.
So Ancel Keys was very good at squashing Eucken. I mean, clearly pushed him out of the arena. Well, in 1977, George McGovern set up the first first United States nutritional guidelines. And if you go back and look at this was 1977, and based on Ancel Keys's strong belief that saturated fat was bad for you, even though I will say he had well-designed, randomized controlled trial in 1976. When it was finished, the study was finished in 1975. A very good, well-controlled, randomized controlled trial. Now, why do I say this randomized control is important? Because I'm tired of listening to this, oh, well, this, if you wear a mask, COVID goes down. Well, it might, but we don't really know that because we've never done a randomized controlled trial. We believe that it works. And I believe a lot of things, but a lot of things I believe haven't proved to be true.
Right.
But so he did a randomized controlled trial and unequivocally showed that a high saturated fat diet was not harmful, that there was no difference in the risk of heart disease in the patients that got a high saturated fat diet versus a low saturated fat diet. And in fact, in that it actually showed there was a higher incidence of cancer in the patients on the low saturated fat diet. But none of this was published until 1989. 14 years later. Why was that? Because Ansel Keys still believed, even though his data didn't support it, that saturated fat was bad for you. So he went to George McGovern and he said, Mr. McGovern, Honorary McGovern, we need to change the nutritional guidelines of America. So George McGovern rounded up some Harvard professors and some other people and said, well, you're right, we need to change the nutritional guidelines of America. So what did they do in 77? They said, you must eat less saturated fat. You must eat less fat in your diet. You must eat more carbohydrates in your diet. So there was this sweeping change of the nutritional recommendations in 1977, and it was endorsed by many societies. But again, it was really based on, sadly, no science whatsoever, just the fact that I believe that saturated fat is bad for you. And I will tell you right now, and I still get critics that do it. I wrote a paper just last year for the American Journal of Medicine. And in that paper, it said, cardiovascular risk reduction. Is it still justified to restrict saturated fat and meat in the diet? And the answer is no. There's no data that shows that if you eat saturated fat or you eat meat, it's bad for you. Now, I will paraphrase that a little bit and say, okay, I'm not saying that if you eat saturated fat and then you consume it with high fructose corn syrup, I think those two together could be pretty wicked. But to say to somebody, you can't eat saturated fat because it's bad for you, there is no science whatsoever that shows that there's a link between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. Again, people say, how can you have to believe fat is bad for you. It clogs your arteries. So saturated fat is going to clog your arteries. Well, it sounds nice, but it doesn't hold up. So then these sweeping changes in nutritional recommendations were done. And then along came a agriculture secretary named Earl Butz. And Earl Butz was under the administration of Nixon. And he was also under one other president as well. But what happened was Nixon was in jeopardy of losing his reelection because of the Vietnam War. So he had to find some way to make people happy. And so he got Earl Butz to just start growing corn like crazy. So in the early 70s, corn was grown wildly in America. It was either get big or go bust. And so we had this huge quantities of corn. Well, corn was cheap. So prices of food went down. And the ability to dramatically reduce the cost of food in America got Nixon reelected. Now, the problem was then we had too much corn. And what are we going to do with all this corn? Okay, we got to do something with it. Well, the Japanese were perfecting the conversion of corn to high fructose corn syrup. And this is actually went back over 20 years. People were trying to do this for over 20 years, but all the methodologies use things like cyanide. Cyanide's not going to work very well in the human body. Mm-hmm. But in 1975, Earl Butz visited Japan, and they found that they found this technique to convert cornstarch into high fructose corn syrup. And so this became, and it was a very nice, gooey, sticky substance that tasted delicious. And it was also cheap to make. It was very cheap to make. So then if you look at high fructose corn syrup in the United States, In 1975, it was only about 1 or 2% of the total consumption. So as high fructose corn syrup came out, there wasn't this big surge in the use of it. It was pretty flat. But around 1980, it took off like a rocket. And it went from like 4% in 1979 to like 16% in 81 and like 20% in 82. And I'm looking and saying, wow, what's happening? Why this mass craze for high fructose corn syrup? Well, one thing was it was cheap. But the other thing was, which nobody talks about, is Hurricane Allen. Hurricane Allen with an E, A-L-L-E-N. Hurricane Allen was a Category 5 hurricane, the strongest hurricane ever recorded, 190 miles per hour, all throughout the Caribbean. So what happened? There was no sugarcane. It was gone. It was wiped out. And on top of that, we were having a lot of battles with the Caribbean people about taxes on sugarcane. So they wanted more taxes, and Americans were struggling and fighting. Well, high fructose corn syrup came to the rescue. It cost 1/4 the price, 1/4 the cost of sugarcane, and it was cheap. Like I said, very cheap. So industry said, well, gee, why battle? We can't battle, but there's no sugarcane anyway. But even if there was sugarcane, why battle with them and pay all these tariffs? We'll just make our own high fructose corn syrup and make products. And that's exactly what happened. And remember that the new nutritional guidelines said you should eat more carbohydrates in your diet. So guess what? People consumed more carbohydrates in the way of high fructose corn syrup in their diet. And in 1980, the daily caloric intake for Americans went up 425 calories a day. 425 calories a day. And even then I said, wow, what would trigger that? I mean, just because you have high fructose corn syrup, why would that by itself have you consume 425 more calories? I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. Well, you got to remember 7-Eleven. Remember 7-Eleven, the big gulp?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in 1976, they introduced the cup. It wasn't called the big cup, it was called the cup. And Coca-Cola introduced this to 7-Eleven. And 7-Eleven says, well, we've got a 12 ounce and we got a 12 ounce and an 18 ounce. Why do we want a 32 ounce cup? What the hell, why do we want that? And Coca-Cola says, I don't know, we just made them. Here, take them. You can do what you want with them. So 7-Eleven said, well, they looked at their data and said, hey, there's a place in California that likes soda. It seemed like it was a high use of soda in this 7-Eleven area. So they took the cups down there and they offered them for like 18 cents for a 32 ounce. And no deposit, no return. Because remember, before you used to have bottles and you had to bring them in and out.
Yeah.
Those cups sold out in like 6 hours. And then they said, wow, this is kind of popular. Well, what happened in 1980? The big gulp was introduced again in 1980. And so you could now go into a 7-Eleven. And remember, in the old days, the man behind the stand had to fill your cup. So you'd go up to the counter and say, I want a 32 ounce Coca-Cola. So he'd go back and fill the Coca-Cola for you. Well, that took a lot of time and the lines got longer. So they said, well, hell, we'll just ingenue it. We'll just have a self-service thing. Mm-hmm. So here they were the first self-service people. So I could go in and get my 32 ounce Coca-Cola for the same price that it used to cost me for an 8 ounce with sugarcane. Well, I'm not going to not take advantage of 24 extra ounces of soda for the same price.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was when it was introduced. And that's, I think, the driver there. So the hurricane to me was the ultimate thing, because until then, high fructose corn syrup really wasn't used a lot in the United States. But when all of a sudden you don't have it, you must go to plan B. And I'll give you, a lot of people about Coca-Cola remember the new Coke. Okay, everybody was talking about, remember the new Coke that came out in the 80s? Do you remember that?
Mm.
You remember the new Coke?
I don't think. What was
I think
different? Remind me.
it was what happened was Coke said we're going to change our recipe in 1980. And they had to because they didn't have any sugar cane. Okay. So what they did was they did a mixture of sugar cane and high fructose corn syrup. And it was awful. People hated it. They said, you know, they're cartoons, people pouring their Cokes down the drain. You know, I'm not drinking this crap. Okay. So then Coca-Cola said, and I think this was all by design. People think this was just a mistake by them. I think they engineered this. I mean, I look back and think they were geniuses. They were well ahead of their time. So they said, okay, you're right. Our new formula just isn't working. We're going to go back to our old original Coke. Okay. And that's what no, when I went back to the original one, it was fine. The only difference was the original Coke was sugarcane. The new original was actually high fructose corn syrup. Okay. So they flipped it and put high fructose corn syrup in, and the taste, high fructose tastes good. So
sweeter,
much sweeter. And so people then went to that. Since then, that's when this thing took off to me. And there's no question that's a driving force. But, you know, one other fascinating thing was, okay, so, but I don't understand. I still couldn't understand why the increase in heart disease in the 40s, you know, because that doesn't all fit in here. And the whole thing that triggered all of this was heart disease. And Ansel Keith's belief that saturated fat was bad for you, he convinced them to change to more carbs. More carbs meant high fructose corn syrup, and you can go on. But it still didn't answer the question of heart disease. Well, there was a brother and a brother-in-law. I think it was a brother-in-law. And the brother was Procter, and the brother-in-law was Gamble. So remember Procter and Gamble? Okay. Well, Procter and Gamble were into making candles and soaps. That was very popular in the early 1900s and the late 1800s because people liked candles and people liked soap. But they had trouble getting the materials because most of it came from beef and cattle remains, their tallow. And so they had trouble getting those products because the industry had a very strong control on it. So they went to cottonseed oil, and they started looking at cottonseed oil to make candles and soap. Well, a scientist, a person from, and I'm going to pull up his name, it was E.C. Kaiser. E.C. Kaiser was a chemist in Germany. And he came to Procter and Gamble, that's before they were actually Procter and Gamble, the company, and said, I have a marvelous thing for you. And he showed them a blob of fat. And they said, what's this? And he said, this is cottonseed oil. And they said, no, it can't be cottonseed oil because cottonseed oil is a liquid. He said, well, I hydrogenated it. I hydrogenated the cottonseed oil, and I'm able to make it into a blob of fat. And like Procter and Gamble were just mesmerized of, oh, this is great. But they realized they weren't making any money in candles and that, so they started to go into the food industry. Mm. And guess what product they made? Crisco. Now, did you ever cook in Crisco? Mm-hmm. I'm sure you did. My mother, everything was cooked in Crisco. Well,
listen to this accent. Tell me I didn't know what Crisco was.
Yeah, exactly. So Crisco was a partially hydrogenated cottonseed oil. That's what Crisco stands for. Chris is for cottonseed, and then the company, Crisco. And no question in my mind that the introduction of trans fatty acids in 1911, when Crisco was put out on the market, had to be a contributor to the increase in heart disease that was seen 20 and 30 years. And so, but interestingly, when you look at trans fatty acids, I don't think anybody really thought they were important or bad or anything like that. I mean, in fact, I'm going to try to see if I can find this, but there was I have to get the exact name because I want to get it right. It's a company that is supposed to look out for the well-being of Americans, okay? And it's come on. Oh yeah, it's called the Center for Science in the Public Interest, CSPI. Okay, Well, they got on McDonald's case because they cooked in beef fat, coconut oil, and palm oil. And they just had a conniption. They said, you just can't do that. That's bad for Americans. So they convinced in 1984, they changed to partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. That's what McDonald's did in 1984. Interestingly, Burger King got on it right away and said, we changed right away. They saw this market. And so they switched to partially hydrogenated vegetable oils as well. And here's a quote from the CSPI. CSP described Burger King switched to partially hydrogenated oils as in 1986, a great boom to the American arteries. So this was supposed to help our arteries so we could live longer. Well, we now know that the only fat that really drives heart disease is trans fatty acids. So amazing to think that, everybody thought that saturated fat was bad for you and, well, trans fatty acids. But there's no question, I think the World Health Organization has made a goal to eliminate trans fatty acids by the year 2025. Now, I will say with a caveat on that, you have to define what they mean by eradicating trans fatty acids. You or I would think that means that all the foods I have do not have any trans fatty acid in. Well, that's just not the case. Apparently, not apparently, according to the FDA, if it's less than 0.5 grams of trans fatty acid per serving, then you don't have to report it. You can say it's 0 trans fatty acids. And you say, well, okay, well, what's the big deal? Well, if I know that it's going to have more than 0.5 grams per serving, then I just change the number of servings in the container. So instead of 6 servings, it's 12 servings. And I'll give you a perfect example, which it makes me laugh. You'll see these advertisements for Pam. And I'm going to think that's Pam. Don't get me wrong. I'm not anti anything. I think Pam is a good product. But on the label, it says, your cooking spray does not have has 0 calories. 0 calories. And I said, wait a minute, how can a fat have 0 calories? Well, if you read the label and you read it very carefully, they have 473 servings per can of Pam. 473 servings. Well, you look at a serving was defined as, what was it? I have to always look this up because I'm just blown away. By a serving was defined as 1/4 second when you press the can. Well, most people, when they press the can, they do at least a second, not a fourth of a second.
Mm-hmm.
They might do 2 or 3 seconds. But if you did 4 seconds, you'd have 16 calories. But if you only do 1, you have 4 calories. As long as it's less than 4 calories, you could say it's 0. So a lot of deception goes on. And another real deception I kind of get, I had to get my meds renewed. So I was over at the pharmacy, and while you're waiting in line, I looked at some of the foods on the shelf, and I saw this one food I didn't read, and I read it said modified cornstarch. What's modified cornstarch? I looked it up. It's kind of hard for me to define it any different than high fructose corn syrup. But when you call the company, oh no, it's not high fructose corn syrup. Well, what'd you modify it? Well, we just made a little modification. Yeah, okay. Please, let's be more candid, more honest, more open. But
don't you think this kind of information will get people more interested and knowledgeable? But how do we beat those large entities that seemingly have out moneyed us or out thought us or whatever? And even those that did it unintentionally because they didn't know.
right.
How do we correct that today?
That's the, we used to say the $64,000 question. Now I have to say with inflation, we have to say it's the $64 million question. The challenge is that I hate to say it, but people get bought. I mean, come on. I mean, congressmen, senators, somebody comes in and says, hey, if you're nice to me, I'll give you $1 million for your campaign. And one thing it's important to disclose is that when George McGovern did his nutritional guidelines. I told you he brought some key
Mhm.
experts in to do that. Well, one of those experts actually worked and was funded by the sugar industry. And he published a paper with his colleagues in the New England Journal in I think it was 1977. And they basically said that, fats are bad for you and sugars are not bad. They didn't say, they were kind of waffly around the way they said it, but they were very dishonest. It was a very dishonest paper. And when the New England Journal found out that they had not disclosed, because nobody disclosed at that time, there was no disclosure requirements. They said, well, wait, you're making these recommendations and you're somebody's feeding your back pocket. I mean, that leaves a lot of ethical questions. Well, New England Journal blew up. They were furious. So now look at any paper you publish. I mean, when I wrote that paper on fat, and I told you about fat and red meat, I must have had to sign 9 documents to say, that I have nothing, nobody's feeding me here, nobody's massaging me here. This is all up and up. I'm very candid. I'm not being paid by anybody. So there was a lot of dishonesty. And in fact, Ancel Keys, which I only learned maybe 6 months ago, was that the Sugar Foundation originally had a different name that was started in the 40s. The first person they funded was Ancel Keys to study the impact of sugar on health. And so he clearly was influenced by the sugar industry as well in his insistence that, saturated fat was bad for you. So I think until politicians and people really say to themselves, look, we have a real crisis on our hands. If we don't address this now, we're going to bankrupt our economy. I mean, we're doing a good job of bankrupting it right now, but just adding this epidemic of obesity and heart disease and all that. I mean, we don't have enough money in the till to do this. But to get people to change is going to be challenging.
Yeah, the change for people. And while I was going to ask you about anxiety, our time is just about up. I was going to ask you about how anxiety shows up in your patients and with all this. I think I can quickly sum that up by saying, why wouldn't it when you get this understanding? But when we that are listening may not be in a place with the politicians and with the people to make those changes, what is one thing? That's what I want to end with today. What is one thing I could do for myself, others could do for themselves to identify a high fructose corn syrup that you could say that the wrong fat, whatever it is that combines to make, tell me one food that we should avoid or one food that would be a go-to. Tell me something that they could go home with this evening and do for themselves well.
Well, I'm not sure I can I can say I get tired of hearing this food is bad, this food is good. I mean, if this food was bad, why are so many people eating it? And some of those people that are eating it live to be 80 and 90 years old, okay, because they're somewhere in Africa. So I don't think it's a specific food. I would say this. I would look at the labels very carefully for high fructose corn syrup. Now, the high fructose corn people tell me, Dr. Lardinois, you're being unfair to us. You're chastising us. And I said, well, maybe in some way I'm over. But I said, our body was not designed to metabolize a lot of fructose. Okay, small quantities in some fruits and that, fine. But our body, our only organ that can metabolize fructose is our liver. And it doesn't take much fructose to saturate that. So I would say, if you limit the amount of high fructose corn syrup by limiting your calories, then you probably will do okay. But when you have the opportunity to get a 32-ounce Coke at an 8-ounce price, people they're not dumb. They're going to go for the 32. And so I would say, look at your food choices. I don't think there's any bad food. I mean, I guess maybe there are, but I don't want people to think that things are bad. Look at it on a positive side. Be more diligent in what you look at. I would honestly say, I tell people, look at the labels. If it's got high fructose corn syrup, look for an alternative. I I think that there are other healthier choices. If the product says anything about partially hydrogenated, and they still do. I was at a hotel in Green Bay and I was going to just have some cornflakes because I hadn't had cereal for a long time. And I read the label and it said partially hydrogenated flakes. I was like surprised, but it said 0 trans fatty acids. Well, I know it can't be 0 because it's partially hydrogenated, but it's less than 0.5 probably, so it doesn't have to be recorded.
No.
And then I would say another thing is really take time to a few things. Number one, take time to exercise. Take time for a little meditation or just, quiet time with yourself. Work to be among friends. Because what people don't understand is when you look at a very fascinating group called Obesity, where they're looking at like longevity and all that, what are the key factors in how people live longer? It's if they have friends and if they have relationships. That's more important to longevity than your risk of dying from smoking, alcohol, heart disease. I'm not saying you should be guzzling down beers like crazy or smoking like a chimney, but people who have close relationships, intimate as well as friend relationships, live a much longer life.
That is so good. So let me tell you my takeaways. And if you agree, we're going to close right here. Somebody that is type 2 and they have not stopped drinking Coke. They've not stopped drinking something loaded with sugar, not even to move to a diet. You're saying, be good to yourself, listen to this, understand what high fructose corn syrup is, and at least don't go for the cheap version of 32 ounces.
Right.
Go back to 8 and work yourself off to an alternative.
Yes, an 8-ounce high fructose corn syrup drink is better than a 32 ounce.
Than a 32 ounce. And the other one, I'm trying to find it. The other one is foot and fork disorder.
Right.
Get your foot to moving.
That's right.
And lay your fork down or find an alternative.
Right.
From
I actually have utensils I use in a cartoon, and the cartoon is that the spoon has a hole in it, the fork is all bent up, and there's barbarian spears coming out of the knife. So you can't grab the knife, the fork doesn't work, and the spoon has a hole in it. So you can also order new utensils. In fact, just to wrap it up, a very funny thing, and I've not heard much about this, but there's actually a product in Germany. I have not heard much about it lately, but it's a fork, okay? And when you start eating, you eat too fast, the fork starts vibrating and tells you to slow down.
That's okay.
I don't know if that's still out there, but it actually would start vibrating and telling you, hey, you not 16 bites per second, you need to slow down.
That's so funny. That's so funny. Thank you so much for coming. This has been even more than I had anticipated. I anticipated a good hour, but this has been so much more than I had anticipated. And I do believe that people can be influenced by that. So I'm hoping they look you up, follow you. There's plenty to read about. There's plenty to know. And we're going to find you, sir. We're going to keep up with you. Thank you for what you do.
Is this tape available for me to share with other people?
Absolutely. As soon as we get it edited, we'll see that it gets over to you.
All right. Appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.